Okay, folks. Well, welcome to our advanced training. Today we're going to be talking about the Social Security Work Incentive Plan to Achieve Self-Support, which for short we call PASS. And Kevin is going to lead you through this training today. If you have any questions, you can certainly raise your hand or put a question in the chat, and we will certainly address it. And if we need to, open up phone lines. So Kevin, take it away.
Well, thanks, Mary Lynn, and thanks, folks, for joining us today. I didn't expect a huge audience today because, as we've discussed, these are more advanced topics, and it is hard if you haven't gotten the CWIC or Cornell training to look at these incentives through the lens we need to. So, and looking over our audience today, I know that each of you is certified, so you've come to the right place. So welcome. Let's look at what we're going to try to cover today. A lot of information as usual, but here's our agenda. We're just going to go over the purpose of the PASS, and then we'll look at the mechanics of the PASS. What does it really take to do this? Then we'll look at the actual PASS application, which will be a joy. You're going to love that. And then we're going to review a tool that we created to support your use of PASS with participants that we call our AIDEN Spending Plan and SSI Calculator. Now you might say, well, we already have had a review of this spending plan, and we do have that tool. But this one includes an SSI calculator because that's the audience that you should be targeting for the use of this incentive, and we thought this would be a nice tool for you to support and make this easier. Finally, we'll end with just an example of the math of how PASS impacts an SSI benefit and a little bit of an example. I hope at the end we'll have time for a few questions and answers. So that's our goal. For those that do want to collect CEUs on this training, the agenda will be attached, if not already, on our website. So let's take a look at the plan to achieve self-support. This work incentive has been around quite a while. It is very much underutilized. Interestingly, I want to tell you that we have a member within the AIDEN family that is very skilled in the use of PASS. Probably why they didn't need to sit in on today's training, because they're one of the most prolific writers of PASS in the country, if you can believe that. So we're pleased that they're in our fold. Like I said, though, a lot of times this is not used much. I think because, like most work incentives with Social Security, this is complicated to implement and to manage. But let's talk about what it is, and we'll go from there. It is a work incentive, and it's intended to support folks that want to return to work at gainful levels of employment. And that's important because the folks that we serve through AIDEN have stepped up with goals of gainful employment. So we have folks potentially that would be good applicants for PASS. Now there's a lot more pieces to this puzzle we have to look at as to whether somebody's a good candidate or not. And welcome, Rachel. I'm glad to have you here today. So we're going to look at a lot of the different pieces, but generally speaking, the folks that we serve through AIDEN have this goal of obtaining gainful employment, as you know, because it's written right into their IWP. So the objective of PASS is simple. It's to help beneficiaries find employment that significantly reduces SSI benefits or eliminates SSDI benefits. Now, whenever I do these trainings, I want you to know that I try to pull things from the POMS. And I see Sandy with us. Great to see you too, Sandy. I try to pull things from the POMS. That's the operating manual that Social Security uses, okay? So the language is sometimes confusing that I put in these trainings because it comes right from the POMS. And I wanted us to get used to that language that's used. So PASS allows, what does it do, really? So it allows people that receive SSI to have resources that are above the resource limit, and I want to just check in on my experts on the line, because all of you are certified that are here today. Somebody just type in the chat for me so I can make sure you're actually awake with me here today and looking at this with me. What's the resource limit for folks that receive SSI if they're single? So you go ahead and think on that, but what it does is it allows people, very good, Rachel, you've got it right on the money, $2,000. Not a lot of money, is it? So that's a problem when people have goals and earnings that are significant. So what do we do with those earnings? One way we can protect them is through PASS. So we can put money into an account, a plan to achieve self-support. Social Security will not look at resources in that account that has been approved. It has to be approved, of course, even if it's above the $2,000 resource limit. So that's one big advantage. And we'll talk about the funding mechanism. Not everybody saves money and then purchases whatever the item or service is that they will lay out in their plan. Some people will actually take a loan and pay monthly. So it can look differently for different folks and based on different goals. Now notice the second part of what I put in this bullet. It says, as long as the recipient uses the protected funds for approved expenditures and follows through with the outlined steps in the past. I can't tell you how critical this is, and I have written many PASS plans over the years. Most of the time, I think all but one, in my history anyway, went quite nicely and smoothly, and people got what they wanted from this, and in fact got a little more financial support with this goal as a result of the PASS. But I do remember one individual, and I just felt terrible because he dipped into that, and it wasn't for a irrelevant expenditure, and the poor guy was dipping into it to pay for, I think, his rent or something at the time. It doesn't matter. It was used for something other than the planned expenditure. What can happen then is that they can just say the PASS is off. You didn't follow through, and anything that you got is considered an overpayment. So it can end up terribly if we don't counsel people correctly and make sure that we have somebody in the mix that's going to follow through with the steps that we will outline in this plan. Now, the other thing that the PASS does, so it does protect resources. That's one important piece of a PASS. But the other thing that it does, which is equally important in my mind, is that it can help an SSI recipient recoup some or all of the costs of the item or service associated with them achieving the goal that we outlined through an increased SSI cash benefit. So, and you're going to see how this plays out a little bit more clearly when we do the math, but basically the money set aside in the PASS isn't counted. And because it's not counted, that impacts how the formula looks and therefore the amount of SSI cash benefits that somebody can receive. So very good. And I saw another response on the resource limit, and you are right, Sandy. It's $2,000 bucks. You got it right. Our newly certified advisor. So let's talk about the purpose of PASS. We already talked about the income that people need to set aside sometimes and want to and have protected, right? So the purpose is, number one, to be able to set aside that income or resource to be used for a feasible and viable work goal. Okay? And we already talked about the resource limit. It can be over the resource limit. So the reason people use a PASS and the reason we look at this as a tool for the folks that we serve is to help to offset the costs associated with a vocational goal that's outlined in this PASS. Now you might say there's lots of other ways to do that, Kevin, and there are potential other ways to pay for some costs. But what I like about PASS is that this can be used in situations where sometimes other resources and sources of funding are not available. And so how this works is by offsetting the costs, right? By reducing countable income. Remember, we always talk about there's gross wages, that's what somebody earns. But after the use of work incentives, what's left and what Social Security looks at is countable wages, not gross wages. All right, so when they're making determinations about somebody as to whether they're gainfully employed, they're looking at countable income, not gross income. Now, there are situations where someone's gross income could be their countable income because there are no work incentives in play, okay? But in this case, when we reduce the money that Social Security looks at by using PASS, certainly that reduces the countable income and thereby increases the amount of SSI cash benefits somebody's eligible for. Now, this is an important piece. It's kind of a nuance, but I say here, which can support living expenses. So really, the way I want you to look at it is this. The money that somebody's using for their goal in a PASS is their money, okay? It's either earned income they're using. It could be unearned income like an SSDI benefit check. Yes, it could be if somebody's a concurrent beneficiary. But somebody has to have a source of income outside of their SSI to inject into this plan because they're using their money, okay? The SSI that they get an increase in as a result of Social Security, not counting these funds, and you're going to see again in the math how this works, that's used to help support the living expenses the person has, okay? So don't look at it like Social Security is paying for this. The person's paying for it. What Social Security is helping with is the living expenses while that person is setting aside sometimes a good chunk of their own income to make this happen. So what can it be used for? Well, to support the costs of education, certainly. That's a strong plan that will most likely always be approved if the steps make sense. It could be for starting a business. So this is a way that sometimes people can get help with some of the costs that might otherwise be hard to figure out. I've, in my own experience, written a plan for self-employment, and we were able to fund about $20,000 in the startup costs of that business using this approach. Or it can be for a purchase of a support service that will result in the SGA level employment that we're looking for, right? So, and that could be lots of different things. It could be, you know, somebody uses this to pay for a job coach. Now, typically that's covered in other ways, right? State VR and so forth. But it could be other supports or services or items, actually, that the person needs. Remember that the bottom line with a PASS is that it always has to result in gainful employment. That's what the whole purpose of the PASS is. That's why Social Security is going to invest in somebody that they approve a plan for, because it's going to lead to less reliance on benefits. So remember, it has to be a significant reduction of SSI. You know, they're not probably going to write off on a plan that's going to help somebody reduce their SSI by $20, okay? It has to be a significant reduction of SSI and or cessation or termination of disability benefits. And again, because most of the folks, I have to correct myself, I think most of the folks on the line today are certified, you'll understand the difference between cessation and termination. Now, I got a question in the chat here, and I'm just going to take them as they come in if I see them, and I see this one. And the question is, can it be used to purchase a car for transportation? Yes, it can, Sandy. I have a specific example of this. There are some parameters that we have to talk about when it comes to that, though. It's not, you know, just because that's what the person wants. It has to be the most reasonable solutions, and we'll cover that. So let's look at a few pieces of how the PASS, the Plan to Achieve Self-Support, works. Well, first we have to identify the needs related to the goal, and of course the costs associated with these needs. And let me tell you, you have to be very clear in how this is laid out. And when we review the application, you're going to see it isn't, you know, just some general idea. It's a very specific idea. It's a very specific goal we have to identify, which shouldn't be a problem, again, for the folks that we serve through AIDN, because if we're serving somebody through AIDN, they have an IWP. If they have an IWP, we have a goal. We have an identified vocational goal that should be realistic and attainable. The cost, though, that can take some time and research. And, you know, I'm not suggesting that you, our members, have to do all that work. That's a joint process with our participant. And a lot of times the participant will know the cost much better than we will for certain things. They might not, though. It might be something new that they've considered, and we might help them with a little of that research. In the example of the PASS I wrote to assist the person with their self-employment, she really knew those expenses better than I did, so she had already done her research. She had a business plan, and so all those things were kind of in there. I pulled them out of that and pulled into the pieces that would qualify, or that I knew would qualify. So what can it support? So items or services that support your vocational goal, okay? And there's so many. This list is not all inclusive, okay? But these are some basic ideas and suggestions as to plans that get submitted, that get approved. So certain business startup costs, remember I talked about that example, and, you know, for example, supplies, equipment, marketing. There's certain things that this PASS will not pay for, though. Like, for example, if you required space for your business and you could buy a piece of land where there was an office on it, that won't work. So it won't work for some things, but it will work for many things for business startup. School expenses, pretty broad and open to be approved there for most expenses. Equipment and tools, that could be related to business, a startup. It could be related to a job that somebody's required to buy tools for. For example, and I don't know if most of you know this, but years ago I used to be a mechanic. And you don't get those tools when you start that job. And it's not exactly a small expense. I think of that for myself personally, but I also helped a fella who was going to work as a mechanic, and I had a soft spot because I knew just how expensive it was to get started as a mechanic, and for the wages you get, it's not an easy transition because it could be thousands and thousands of dollars of tools required. So that's an example. Transportation. Sandy brought up a car. Certainly that's an opportunity to help somebody get a car, but there's certain parameters that have to be met. We'll dig into that more. But it could be other transportation-related costs too. Uniforms or other items or services needed for the goal. Again, if it's very specific to the vocational goal and there's going to be certain expenses, I've laid out some examples for you. Those can be included. I mentioned this earlier too, that in a lot of cases, PASS is designed really to save for your goal and then purchase that item or service. That's why they provided the leeway to exceed the resource limit with an approved PASS. Otherwise, it'd be a problem to save, wouldn't it? But in some cases, it could be that the PASS is written to pay down a loan for the approved. So maybe you can't wait to save that money. And I'm assuming there's good credit in play, right, Sandy? We're not getting a loan without good credit. I'm throwing that out because Sandy is our certified financial coach. Comes right into play with supporting this kind of incentive too, by the way. That's going to be a great experience for you. But if the person has, good credit, and I've worked with folks who've used this path and they get a loan, and we write in the payment of the loan monthly as the PASS expenditure, okay? These applications have to be reviewed by Social Security. In fact, Social Security has a special PASS cadre in each state that reviews these. That's their job. Now, I will say that the number of PASS specialists and PASS cadres have shrunk a fair bit over the years because of, I can only speculate, the lack of use of this incentive. But you will find PASS specialists and PASS cadres in your location too. It might be that they cover a bigger area now, but there's a link here at the bottom of this slide that I've inserted for you to find your PASS cadre. Just as a general note, here's something that I used to do. Because of the length of time it takes, well, number one, it's always about relationships again. Let's talk about that, because when we talked about getting people WIPA services, right, what was the first thing we talked about? Develop that relationship. I did the same thing years ago with the PASS specialist and that I worked with through Social Security. What I used to do is if I had an idea that I thought was viable, I had done some vetting with these folks no matter what, but I sometimes would call that person that I had the relationship with before I even put pen to paper. Yes, I actually used pen and paper back then, or computer to finger. And I used to call and see, like, here's the idea. What do you think? Just float it by them first. And, so that saved me a lot of time in the end. Most of the time they would say, yeah, and they might give me a tip, but do this, this, or this, So it's good to know who the PASS specialist is if you're going to proceed with some of these with the folks that you're serving. I see a question in the chat. It says, how long does it take for the plan to be approved, average time? Well, I hesitate to put a response out there to that, Rosanne, because I don't know every PASS cadre, I don't know every PASS specialist, and it may vary. I can tell you from my experience, though, here in New York, working these plans, that it wasn't a terrible amount of time. I would say in a month, generally speaking, I had a response. Sometimes I might get a response back from the specialist, hey, you need to change this, or can you add this paperwork? They might be missing something to approve it. So, but generally about a month, I would say, would be a fair guesstimate. The form that you will use to collect the information to develop this plan to achieve self-support is called SSA 545BK, and I put a link there that takes you right to the SSA form. But we're going to go through pieces of that in the subsequent slides here. remember that it's important that the person has income other than SSI, okay, or resources to set aside for the outlined goal. So if somebody's getting their full SSI check, okay, so they're not working or they don't have any unearned income that would count against the potential SSI, that isn't the right timing to develop a pass because there's no reduction in the SSI. Therefore, there's no income that's impacting the SSI. So for folks that have a full SSI check, it's probably, you know, the timing isn't right yet, okay? It's only helpful when there's a reduction in that SSI, again, due to that earned or unearned income. Okay, I was just looking in the chat there. I'll let you figure that one out, Mary Lynn. Also, the person has to be a current SSI recipient, or after they set aside their income that we're going to propose in this plan, they would qualify for SSI. Here's what's really interesting, folks, and this is where it gets into the weeds a bit more, okay? It is possible for somebody on disability benefits to become eligible for SSI by using a plan to achieve self-support and setting aside enough earned income that would qualify them then for an SSI payment. Generally, when we talk about PASS, we think of this as a work incentive for people that receive SSI, and indeed it is. The point is, sometimes people on disability could still use PASS by virtue of that set aside that we talked about, reducing the income that Social Security looks at, therefore allowing them to be eligible for SSI. Now, it would only be that the person would be eligible for the period of the plan, because when that set aside is gone, then we're back to the standard math that made them ineligible for SSI. I hope that makes sense. And for folks that have a bit more knowledge about benefits, I think that will. But so the numbers really matter. It's kind of a numbers game and how the math works out in each circumstance. It's not a guarantee that this works for everybody. We really have to evaluate carefully the person's situation, kind of understand the math enough to crunch some numbers roughly to see if it makes sense. So for SSI, the achievement of the PASS goal must substantially reduce SSI benefits. I said that before. I'm going to keep telling you that because it's critical. It will not be approved if we can't show that that's going to be the case. Again, I will say that most folks that we serve through AIDN are going to be great candidates, you know, generally speaking, meaning they have goals that are going to lead to self-sufficiency and therefore substantially either reduce or eliminate benefits entirely, right? I mean, by virtue of the fact that they assign their ticket, we know that's the goal. Now for SSDI, the PASS, if we do bring somebody in, remember I said it's really an incentive for SSI, but we can actually use disability benefits to set aside for the goal, which is then not counted and can make somebody eligible for SSI payments, at least for the interim of the PASS plan itself. PASS has to be developed for that vocational goal that will produce earnings above SGA. Remember that. If the participant is unwilling or unable to produce earnings above SGA, PASS is not going to be approved. It's just, they're just not going to invest, because really what Social Security is doing with this, folks, they're investing in the participant we're considering using this incentive for. How are they doing that? Through an increased SSI check. SGA earnings are not expected immediately, okay, but generally within 12 to 18 months of the approval of the PASS, which, you know, might not jive completely with the time frame we put in the IWP for somebody that's we're working with through AIDN, right? Because we're really looking at SGA level employment minimum for the long-term goal, which is in the 3 to 5 year period. So much like the IWP, though, the PASS has to contain a specific vocational goal, okay? I'll give you an example, plumber, carpenter, I always use those. Very clear what we mean when we use those. Not, I want to work full-time. That's not a vocational goal, okay? This has to be spelled out clearly and will be, trust me, spelled out clearly when you complete the PASS application. Purchasing a vehicle or attaining a college degree is a potential expense, but it's not a work goal. I'm just giving you an example, okay? You can't write this and say, well, I want a vehicle. Well, that's great, but that's not the reason you need the vehicle. The reason you need the vehicle might be because you're going to start as a full-time plumber, okay? And you have projection of wages and so forth that are going to increase or decrease your benefits. Last and certainly not least with this piece, it has to be feasible and realistic. That's Social Security's language. So what do? The same thing we do when we develop a plan with somebody through AIDEN. We examine local labor market information to show the viability of that goal. So you don't have to be the expert. You just have to look, you know, at your local labor market information. Now, what's one tool we could use that we do use? I mean, certainly you could look at that. That is a specific bit of information that labor puts together. But if you're unsure about other pieces of the job, what it looks like and so forth, we could go to the Career Index. That's something we pointed you to help you with career counseling when developing the IWP as well. A vocational evaluation, if available, is very helpful to the PASS cadre. Now, you probably won't have that with most of the folks that you might consider who are AIDEN participants, and that's okay, because I'm going to show you how we can also use our expertise as an employment network to lend credence to the goal, okay? But generally, you know, when this was originally introduced, mostly it was VR that was helping with these, so a vocational evaluation was always in play. I think that's where that comes from. So the plan has to be measurable, right? And when we look at the actual application, you'll see that the way it's laid out makes it very clear how we're going to measure these steps. And it does do that too. The plan has to show the steps that the person will take, really step by step. We're going to do this by this time and this by this time. And we need to be able to build the case really to show how the beneficiary will achieve SGA level employment because of the item or service that we're suggesting they need by using PASS. Again, it's going to be spelled out clearly in the application. There's no way around it. You have to be able to really lay that out nicely in the application. If it is self-employment, I'm going to tell you right now, the person is going to need a detailed business plan. It will be required. I would say really that business plan, you know, the way you look at that, it's the same as you would look at it as if somebody was going to apply for a loan from a bank. That's when we're talking about a business plan, in my mind, that's what we're talking about. So if it would be approved by a bank, it's probably going to be approved by the PASS cadre. So SSA may increase the SSI check after excluding income, right, and or resources set aside in the past. But the person can't ever exceed the federal benefit rate, FBR, right? They're never going to get more than that maximum federal benefit rate. What we're trying to do through utilizing PASS is to bring them back up to that. Let's say they've had a reduction because of work, right? Now we can introduce PASS. That's more of a write-off in terms of the income Social Security looks at, which can potentially increase that SSI check, even up to the maximum federal benefit rate, but never beyond that. So based on how the Social Security SSI formula works, remember, some or all of the income set aside for PASS may be recouped through an increased SSI cash benefit. It is important for you to help your participants understand that they may not see a recoupment of all the money that they put out. Remember, it's their money. They're using their work money, they're using their disability money. Because of how the math works, that participant may have some of the investment in the goal. And it will likely come from the participant. In some cases, 100% recoupment is not possible. It's just the way the math works out. And again, I want you to really have this clear, because if I don't clarify this with you, when you talk to the PASS specialist, trust me, they will clarify this with you. But the purpose of the increased SSI check isn't to pay for the item or service. It's to offset the living expenses for the participant while they use their money to pay for item or service. I hope that's clear. It might not be until we go through some math, but just know, if I was to paraphrase, sometimes your participant will have some skin in the game, and I think that's okay. They may not get 100% reimbursement because of how the math works out, but that's okay. Remember, it's their goal, but they will get, you know, a sizable increase in most cases because of the use of PASS. So this is what the application looks like. It is a kind of lengthy application. I was reminded when I was doing this training how much fun it is to go through these. Don't be intimidated. It really is just a very clear path for them to figure out what the person wants to do. So the other thing I want you to know about this review of the application itself is that I am not pulling every piece of the application in. I pulled in pieces I thought were important to review with you today. So this first part of the application is the work goal. It starts right at the top with what is the work goal, right? I've already mentioned to you, and you can see where I put notes in here in blue. Otherwise, it's just things that are in the application. You've already done this. You've already figured this out with your participant because you have developed an IWP. So you have the goal established in IWP. I've already mentioned this too, that because of our participants have goals above SGA, this is going to align well with the goal of PASS, which is self-sufficiency and or decrease or reliance on benefits, right? So that's why the PASS cadre should really, when they see one of these come in from an employment network, that should be a good sign. They should say, okay, well, we know right out of the gate here what the goal is, right? It's self-sufficiency. It's not just to get a little part-time job for the holidays. The bottom of this first part here talks about job coaching. I put a note, it's not likely that this will occur with AIDN participants. I'm not going to say that it never could. I'm going to say it's highly unlikely that it will. But I don't want to rule it out completely because we do have some AIDN members who focus and, I don't want to put a blanket statement out, but generally speaking, when we think about that, we think of folks that might have a developmental or intellectual disability that would take advantage of job coaching. We do have some AIDN members that focus on that audience solely. Of course, now they're working with many folks because they're open with AIDN now. But they could have that need, and I'm not going to rule it out completely, but generally speaking, you're not going to use that section of the plan. The next part describes the duties and tasks the person would be expected to perform in the job. Now, if you're unsure, I already told you, you can use the Career Index. We've talked to you about that. We think it's a good resource and tool. And you can kind of look at that to examine whether it's a viable goal based on disability. That's why they're asking these questions, folks. What they're trying to sort out is not just if it's a viable goal, but if it's a viable goal based on the person's condition. So if we know somebody has a lifting restriction of 10 pounds and their goal is to, eventually become a UPS driver that has to lift 80 pounds, that's a problem. And I'm going to respond to one question I see here before we get too far beyond this. The question is, she wants to make sure she understands from Karen, basically the individual uses their earned income to put into the PASS. That is correct, Karen. Or it could be that they use disability as an income, okay? Because if somebody's getting disability and they're on SSI, they've got a reduced SSI because they get the disability check. So that would be an acceptable income source to use toward this too, which could then increase the amount of SSI they get. It could be that somebody gets a very small disability check. Let's say they're only getting $850 a month. It wouldn't take much to reduce that person's disability benefit below the amount that would make them eligible for SSI. So it could be somebody that gets disability. We use this to make them eligible temporarily for SSI by using PASS. But generally speaking, you are correct, Karen. It's earned income that the person will put into the mix. So again, Social Security uses this section to examine whether the goal is viable based on the person's disability. We want to make sure that we're looking at something that's realistic and viable. If you want, a job description may be attached to address this question. Again, I like the Career Index as far as a resource for us to be able to answer these questions. So the next question in this application says, how did you decide on this work goal and what makes this type of work attractive to you? Well, you want to talk in this section about why it's a good fit based on not just disability, but the skills, interests, and abilities that the person has. So now play to the strengths a little bit. You already kind of address a little bit above, maybe not, but you've laid out the job above. They already know the disability because they have the person's record. But in this section, you could also lay out why this is a good fit in terms of the person's disability. Let's see. And then there's some other basic questions here I didn't make comment on because they're pretty straightforward. Let's go to the next slide here and see. So this next section of the PASS application examines if the person has a goal of self-employment. And I think this is interesting. I think it's a fair question in Social Security. They want the person to explain why working for themselves will make the person self-supporting, more likely so than working for someone else. I think, there's a lot of legitimate reasons why people choose self-employment. It is so darn complicated, unfortunately, when people go down this path. As an advisor of many years, I always cringed when people said, I want self-employment as a goal. I'm like, okay, I will help you, but it is definitely going to be more complicated. And it has to be viable. A lot of people would come in too, and just know that you're a filter in a lot of ways. You're not just going to throw anything at the wall to see what sticks. Okay, that's not the way we should do business. And I don't want to squash people's dreams either, but let's just be fair and balanced here. If somebody comes in and they want to do a particular job as a contractor, let's say, and you just know they don't have the ability to do that, you need to be the filter, folks. You need to be the reality check. Again, I'm not trying to squash people's dreams, but we do have to reel it into a reality that we know Social Security would latch on to as well. So if somebody comes in with a GED and they want to be a brain surgeon, how much more obvious can I make this as an example? Probably not going to be the most viable goal to pay for education to make that happen, potentially. It might be, but potentially. So you're there as a filter, especially with self-employment goals. Now, I had different ways to do this. I had a line on a fella that I worked with closely from our small business development center. So I didn't always have to be the end-all, be-all decider of whether that was a good idea. I often put somebody in front of that person as well before I would advance anything with a PASS application if I had concerns. Okay? Often that, well, not often, every time I did get that gentleman in the mix anyway, if there was a self-employment goal. But he was very useful in helping me to parse out, okay, what do you think? Is this gonna fly in the real world? That's what I want to know. That's what I want to figure out before I'm even going to attempt to put this into Social Security. Now, any self-employment goal has to be accompanied by a detailed business plan. I told you that before. I just want to clarify that really, again, has to be similar to what you would use to obtain a loan from a bank. So it has to be laid out. It has to be realistic. If you don't think you could put that business plan in front of a bank or a banker to get a loan, it's probably not going to fly with the PASS cadre. They're going to look at it in the same way. And let me tell you that in and of itself is a challenge to develop a very solid business plan. I used for years, the agency I worked for actually had a grant that they received to put together a business planning guide for folks. It was pretty basic, worked pretty well for this purpose, and that's what I would put in front of folks. And listen, I wasn't the one writing their business plan, okay? So if somebody came in, one of my first flags that would go off is, will you help me write a business plan? That was the first flag that would be raised in my mind, is if you can't write the business plan, I don't know if you can run the business. Now, having said that, I was fair, though, with folks and said, well, lots of people don't know what that even looks like, but could have a very legitimate business idea. That's why I would put them in front of this business planning tool and let them run with it and see if they could get that done. I was there to support things. I wasn't necessarily putting together the business plan for people, and I don't think that's your job either, okay? Next, these questions are used to evaluate whether someone had a plan before. If somebody has, it doesn't mean they won't be approved for a subsequent plan. I think what they really want to highlight is, was there a plan that the person had and it just, they didn't follow through? Obviously they're going to look at whether this is a good risk. So this is risk assessment, if you will, from Social Security's end. That's really what this is for. So that's just to evaluate whether they should move forward or not based on risk. Now here's where we come in, folks. It says, have you assigned your ticket to work? Yes, they have, and you're going to put the name and organization there in that line, okay? So Social Security is using this section to evaluate whether the goal was developed by an approved EN. If there's a vocational evaluation, that's different. Great, they're going to use that. in lieu of that, if they know that the person's open with an employment network, that tells them a lot, right? I mean, it is their program, so they know a little bit about it. And they certainly know that anybody open with the ticket program has an IWP and, you know, has a viable goal that's going to help that person achieve gainful employment and eventual self-sufficiency. So it aligns with everything we're trying to achieve. What you should do here is enter the American Dream Employment Network as the name of the EN, and then the AIDN member address and phone number. That's you. Okay, so I'd put American Dream Employment Network, and then whatever site you are and a phone number there, name and phone number. And again, just the last thought here. When somebody's working with either state VR or an employment network, the goal will generally be considered favorably. Now, to give you a little historical context here, folks, whether you want it or not, I want you to understand that years ago, and Marilyn and I go back to the inception of this legislation, which is kind of neat to see all the changes. But when we first became an EN, I remember submitting to the PASS cadre, which I had done because I had been an advisor for a decade prior to that legislation, and I had worked with them. But as an EN, you know, but I always got the vocational evaluation, folks. That's how I did it in years past. But when we became an EN, I didn't do that. And they kind of pushed back and said, well, you know, I don't know if we can prove this without a vocational evaluation. And I reminded them, well, you have, by virtue of giving us this blanket purchase agreement, agreed that we have the credentials to establish goals, much like vocational rehabilitation state agencies do. Have you not? And of course, they had to agree with that because, you know, that's what we had to go through to become an employment network. We had to have the requisite skills and experience. Therefore, it was, I'm just giving you that history because in the beginning, I don't think they were kind of shying away from the EN being the one that could kind of put together this goal, but that's changed over the years. So you should be looked favorably at by the PASS cadre. The second part of this application really looks at the medical and vocational educational background of your participant. Now you may say, well, they have all this stuff on file, don't they? Well, not necessarily. So they do want a listing of the person's disabling illnesses, injuries, or conditions. Because frankly, those things can change too, even though they might have something on record. You know, things might have changed. Again, this is used to determine the viability based on the condition the person has. Is it the right fit? You know, I'll go back to my silly examples of the person with a 10-pound lifting restriction wanting to be a UPS driver that has to lift 80 pounds. Not a good fit, all right? Not rocket science. Sometimes it gets more confusing than that. You know, physical limitations are pretty straightforward. That's why I use those examples. But it could be that somebody has anxiety disorder and their goal is to be in customer service. I don't know if that's going to be a good fit, right? So we're just using our common sense here. Again, not rocket science, but this is what Social Security is doing with this section. They're looking at, is this viable? Is it realistic? Do we think the person can do this based on their condition? Have you thought about ways to mitigate this? And that's why you're looking at this particular job. So the next questions we're going to look at in this have to do with the person's work history, educational attainment, and specialized training. I don't think I put that in here. I just want you to know that's the next part of the application. And I didn't need to because that's basically what it covers. But this section says, have you ever had or expect to have a vocational evaluation or an individualized written rehabilitation plan or an individualized plan for employment? I would say yes here, and then attach and provide a copy of the AIDN IWP. Now remember, if you're working with the PASS cadre, you should, this is kind of a basic thing, but maybe I should put it in here. You should have a 3288 in place so that you can speak to Social Security. That should already be in place. You might want to provide a copy of those 3288s to the PASS cadre, which is a different office than the local office. You might have submitted those 3288 consent for release of information forms already to collect the BPQY. You have them, but you might have to pass them on to the PASS specialist, okay? But that opens the gate for you to have communications, which we need because I want you to provide a copy of the IWP that will show that there's a viable goal. And then just enter the American Dream EN with agency address and phone number again here, I think, is what I would do. Just to give you a little encouragement, I put this bullet at the bottom that talks about, you know, our participants don't go through a formal vocational evaluation like they might with state VR. But providing that IWP will be really useful to the PASS specialist in evaluating the viability. That's what this is all about. They just are trying, you know, from their end to mitigate risk. All right, they're not just trying to hand out dollars through approving as many of these PASS applications as possible. It has to be something that they think is going to work. There has to be a return on investment. I want you to think about it that way. You don't have to promote it that way to participants, and I wouldn't, maybe not so directly, but it really does. There has to be a return on investment. That's what you're trying to show in this. Now, then the real meat and potatoes of the plan starts in part 3, which is entitled Your Plan. We're going to put when it is to begin and when it is to end. Now, what isn't really clear in here, but I can tell you is in the POMS, is that the PASS is generally written for an 18-month period. It can be extended for another 18-month period and for another 12-month period only in the cases of education. But any PASS that's approved can be written for 18 months and then extended another 18 months if there's more needs that come up, if there's some adjustments that need to be made, and so forth. And the total length is no more than 4 years, and that's only in the case of education. So if you're wondering, how do I know when to begin and end? There you go. There's your answer. It's right in the POMS. So, but this section here, you notice how it says the step, the beginning date, and then completion date. This section is what you're going to use to lay out the step-by-step plans that you have, okay? And, you know, it could be, you know, well, it's so hard to lay this out because it's very specific to the person's goal. But, you know, with any goal, there's always steps to achieving that goal. Maybe it's somebody's, you know, working part-time and they know they're going to get an increase or, you know, promotion to full-time, and they know the date, and then that's one of the steps, okay, to self-sufficiency. And then they, you know, maybe it's to buy a car, like Sandy said. Okay, well, first we're gonna inspect some cars. Next, we're gonna purchase the car and insurance, and you know, so there's a multitude of steps that could be written up. I could dig up some old examples, and I'm sure there's some online I could pull up if you wanted to see that. But it is very individualized. That's why it was hard for me to just lay out what that might look like. The next section lays out the expenses. So we have the steps. Here's how I'm going to do it. And here's how I'm going to pay for it. And here's the things that it requires to get there. And two, again, the question about the vehicle, you propose to purchase or lease a vehicle. Okay. Now here's the answer to your question, Sandy, why and how this is looked at. If we're going to purchase a car and we want to use this to purchase a car, which by the way, I've done many times with folks. And I will say in the early days, it was a lot easier and it wasn't scrutinized quite as much as it is now. If you're going to go down this path, here's what you need to do. You need to explain why that's the least expensive form of transportation, why public transportation won't work, or cabs, in reaching the goal. Well, you know, look, here, it's pretty straightforward. A cab is not going to be the solution long term. That's going to be way expensive, and I think we all know that. So that's not the long-term solution that's going to be most financially viable, right? Next, we might look at transportation, public transportation. Why isn't that going to work? Well, maybe the guy's on a second shift, and where he lives, that public transportation doesn't come by. Maybe it goes one way, but not the other way. Or maybe if he had a car, he could move into a second shift position and, you know, get a raise. There's lots of reasons why we could promote that a car makes the most sense. I'm going to tell you the truth is that a lot of rural areas, especially in like where I was doing all this work in rural New York, it was pretty easy to sell that a car was the most viable form of transportation. In a big city, probably not. I can't imagine why that would be the most viable form of transportation. Probably wouldn't be. So it probably wouldn't work. So it really depends where you live, what your situation is, and if you can prove that that is the best way to go. I gave you those expenses down below there, or those examples below, so you can look at them. So when we justify the expenses in the application, it's a hugely important part of the process. We don't want to go too far. We don't want to ask for too much, but we want to, you know, here, I'll give you an example. One time I put in for a PASS for a car, and, you know, the PASS specialist knew me at that point for a little bit. She's like, Kevin, why are you being so cheap? I don't know if I want to prove this for a car for only $3,000. So I was pleasantly surprised. That was the first car submission that I had. So I didn't know that they were going to be looking at it in that way too. So she was basically saying, hey, if we're going to do this, let's do this for something that's going to be reliable. Because, you know, I don't want something that's going to last for a year and then this guy's back in the same boat he was before he had a car, right? So I actually upped the ante and I wrote that plan for about $7,000 for a really decent used car. If you are submitting for a car, you'll need to show that it is the most reasonable. We already talked about that. Also for a car, last thing I'll say about this, you need to make sure that if it's a used car, which it probably will be, you have to have that inspected. Now, here's a real funny little tidbit for you guys. I asked, I said, who would I bring that to? And the past specialist said, well, a mechanic. I said, well, I was a mechanic. You know, I have a 2-year degree in auto tech. Will that do for you? And she kind of chuckled. She said, wow, you're a one-stop shop. So I remember in that instance, I actually inspected that vehicle too for the gentleman. I looked it over carefully. He drove. I think he's still driving that darn car today. That was 10 years ago. Now that's probably not a good sign because I don't know if he's making enough to upgrade that now. I was hoping he would, but let's just say he drove it for many years. But that was just kind of a funny sidebar. I actually did that for him too. Oops, there's a few more things here. If it's for equipment, you need to justify the need for the specific equipment requested. In other words, why do you need that? And why isn't there an alternative to that? Why couldn't we lease a computer? Why is it cheaper to buy a computer? All right, and then you could say, well, based on the time frame we need this computer for and how long a computer lasts, it would be cheaper to buy it than to lease it. So there's lots of ways you can justify these things. Of course, there's space provided to highlight each of these items or services required to achieve the goal. Now, if, again, for a vehicle, and this is something initially when I started doing these I didn't think of, but you can write out other expenses like insurance and registration. You can add that in, okay? You really do need to be prepared, though, to discuss the cost of each of these items or services and details about the item. So you really have to do your research. That's what I'm telling you. We are also in a budget going to have to lay out the current living expenses the person has. That's required to show that the participant can afford to set aside the money that we're talking about, okay? We need to be able to be realistic about that too. And that's why we have developed the spending plan to support that. Now, normally, I was going to show you that. I don't know if we're going to have time today to do that. So Mary Lynn, I may just have to ask folks to look for that on our website, or maybe I will share that on a future huddle. So this next part of the application talks about funding. Again, we talked a lot about that. It will ask if the person has some of the items already that they own that they could use to reach the work goal. Most times people don't. That's fine. But it really is trying to figure out how you're going to save money. Are you going to save money? Are you going to use stuff you own? What income sources will you use? You know, if you're saving for the plan, are you going to have a separate account? Are you going to commingle that with another account, which I don't recommend, by the way. I would highly recommend the person establish a new account just for this past money, so there is no commingling, so it's easy to see that this has been used for this goal. Again, in some cases, a loan could be secured, and then you're paying back that loan, okay? So that's acceptable, but of course, the person has to have good credit. This section about other contacts, that's where I would put your name, okay? I would put you as the member listed there. You're the person that's helping to prepare the plan. And trust me, Social Security will communicate with you. And I did put a note here, I thought I did somewhere, that you need the 3288s for the purpose of discussing the path with the specialist, okay? You're not going to talk to anybody without consent. So whether it's the local office or the pass cadre, you need those 3288s in play. Last, and here's the piece that I want you to really pay attention to. When I talked about this earlier, I had a very sad story about a gentleman I helped to get approved for pass, and then he spent it on some things which really weren't terrible things. They just were the things that were not what we said we would spend the money on, what he said he would spend it on. And it was terrible to see that get shut down. I felt so bad for that guy. But I can tell you why I felt okay about the process, because I am very clear about how I counsel people that are going to go through this process and use pass, that they better be prepared to follow through, okay? Because if not, you know, any money set aside or provided under pass, so that all those increased SSI checks the person got to help offset their living expenses, that's all one big overpayment that they have to pay back. They will need to return that to SSA. That's not the conclusion I want to see. So we need to be sure that people can comply with the terms of this pass, because failure to do so will result in an overpayment. Not may, will result in an overpayment. So be just very super careful to counsel participants to only apply for these funds if they're in a position to follow through. Okay, and that's where some of your judgment comes into play too. Now again, I was going to review this, but we're a little crunched for time. I want you to go look at this. I don't want you getting dependent on that SSA calculator, by the way. That was experimental. We put that together with, I did have a little bit of a base to start with, which wasn't working, and I did get it working. I think all the math is right. So some of our experts out here today, please go play with that SSI calculator for me and just make sure that it looks right to you, okay, before we get it being used too broadly. I think it's kind of a neat tool. I think you'll appreciate it, and it is located on our website. But this is what I wanted to show you. We can't really stop or end this training without showing you how the math works, because it's all about the numbers. With SSI, it's always about the numbers. So let's look at sort of with pass and without pass, and that's the easiest way for me to look at this with folks. I'll give you a little pointer here. Let's see if we can. So this is all about Beth. I think I use this particular one in the overview that I do as well, but it's a good example. Hang on one second. There we go. So Beth is an SSI recipient, right? So I'm not giving you a real tricky one where we're turning somebody from disability that's on disability and getting them eligible for SSI. She's interested in purchasing a vehicle. Here you go, Sandy. She's working second shift, and there's no public transportation available at that time. She's been getting rides from her coworkers, right? But knows it's not a long-term solution. Beth is working full-time and is making $1,800 a month. She's single and she lives alone. Why do I need to tell you in this example if she's single and she lives alone? Somebody put that in the chat. You're my experts. Tell me why I had to tell you she's single and she lives alone. Thank you, Rachel. You're like a rocket. FBR, that's to establish the federal benefit rate. Perfect. She'd like to save for a car of her own, save for insurance and initial expenses to get the car on the road. And let me tell you, when you stop down to the DMV, you find out about all those initial expenses if you haven't had that pleasure before, but I'm sure all of you have. Some folks have not. I had to educate. Because she's working already and earning above SGA and significantly reducing her SSI, she's going to be a good candidate for PASS, because remember, that's part of the deal. Now, that person doesn't already have to be in that position. I already told you that. As long as they're going to achieve that in the first, about 12, 18 months, we're going to be fine. In this case, she's already there. Next, she will be saving $700 a month for the next 10 months or longer, depending on actual cost of the proposed expenses. So, in other words, we might adjust that a little bit as we go on. But she plans to put $700 of her own money in. All right, we did a budget and showed that if she takes $700 away from her monthly income, she could squeak by. Let's say that that's what the proposed plan looks like. Okay. Now let me do this. What I'm showing you here is two examples up here with PASS and without PASS. So without PASS, let's just look. We would take the income, follow the basic rules of SSI, of the SSI formula, right? 2-for-1 rule. Here we got the 857 in total countable income. We take the 857 away from the federal benefit rate. And what does she get in SSI? Nothing. She has exceeded what? What has she exceeded? Bonus point. What's it called? What is Beth an example of? She's exceeded what they call the, let's think on that. With PASS, let's look at what it's going to do. 1,800, same math. We get to use the break-even point. Good job, Rachel. She's on a roll. Mary Lynn, I think we need to keep track of this. Now with PASS, we're going to do the same math, except for when we get to the total countable income line. Look what happens. That's where we employ the PASS deduction. Now, look, I'm not a math giant, but I can tell you this. If you employ this deduction after the 2-for-1 rule, or the division by 2, what that means is you get full value. That's powerful, folks. That is a powerful work incentive. So instead of 857.50, we subtract 700. That leaves 157.50 that they will count now that PASS is in play. Now look what happens. We subtract only 157 from the 733, leaving an adjusted SSI of 575.50. But folks, you might be thinking, but that didn't recoup all of that money that she was saving. No, it didn't. Remember I told you before? Sometimes folks are going to have some of their own investment in this. It is their goal. That's okay. Now, I actually remember some folks complaining about this in the past. I thought I was going to get it all recouped. I'm like, well, no, that's the math doesn't always work that way. And it is, by the way, going to be your car, right? Yeah, well, that's true. Okay, so let's just keep people directed in the right way here and just remind them this is for their goal. Now, look at the total monthly income after the pass. So I hope that helps you to see very briefly, because I only had an hour with you today, how the math works. It is a bit, complicated in terms of an incentive to wrap your head around, but I think each of you are capable of identifying this in the future, okay? Last, there's a success story here. I like this video. And yes, I could look at it with you now. I think you can see that, but I'm not going to. I'm going to let you pick up where I left off here. And I'm going to stop right there, and I'm going to take maybe one question because I have to head off to the next event. And I apologize I had to go quickly, but does anybody have a question that's burning that they would like to ask before I close shop today? Has this confused everybody? Does this make sense? Is this a starting point? Hopefully this has helped you to see that this is a good incentive. There are a lot of steps to using this incentive. If you haven't used it before, it probably looks a little intimidating. So Karen asked, how long does it take to write a pass on average? Karen, that is a good question because it does take some time to pull this together. I'll be honest, usually I wouldn't be ready to submit an application like this before I've had about 4 meetings with the person I'm working with, okay? So, maybe, and I've done some research, so I'm gonna say that you're gonna have an investment anywhere from 4 to 8 hours into the development of a good plan that will be approved, okay? One more question I'll answer. How about an SSDI person? How can an SSDI person go to SSI? Oh, I know what you're saying, Sandy. So, okay. It's all about how the math works out. So if I'm getting, let me make it very clear. I think this will help you. If I get $800 in disability, I'm not eligible for SSI, right? Because once I take the 20 off, it's still more than the federal benefit rate for me if I'm single living alone. That's why I'm only getting disability. However, let's make it real simple, and this wouldn't work, but let's just, for sake of example, if I put all that $800 into a pass, that means I have 0 income. Would I be eligible then for SSI if I did that in the formula? Yes, I would. That's how somebody on disability can become eligible for SSI, by deducting what they're saving for a plan to achieve self-support in the formula. So it's all about the math. It's all about the numbers. That's why I like it, I think. It's always interesting to see what it would take to make somebody eligible. So again, this is a high-level overview of PASS. This is not, we're not getting into the weeds and how to do every step of this, but so SSDI benefits in it. Yeah, so people on disability could be eligible potentially if we can use enough of that SSDI benefit to reduce it to a point where they'd be eligible for SSI. One more question, and then I really have to go. The person has to be working or have another person to help with their expenses, right? Okay, so another person can't be helping with these expenses. It has to be that person providing the income to put towards this pass, Rosanny. So that's a good question. I'm glad you asked that. It really has to come from that person. They have to have the income. And that's why if somebody's already getting a full SSI check, there is no opportunity to develop a pass. There is no reduction. There is nothing to recoup, right? I mean, that's the short story. There's what I would say is this, folks. If you're going to do this and you don't have a ton of experience writing these, I have 2 options. 1, you can consult with me a little bit, okay? 2, you could consult with WIPA if you happen to be a member that's also utilizing WIPA. Most of you on the line today, I think, are providing the service directly, which I'm really pleased about. Or 3, you could utilize professional consulting services and potentially contract with our member that is the most prolific writer of PASS plans in the country. So that's an option, okay? So there's plenty of options. I'm always here for you to back you up, but it is a pretty involved process. Again, today is just to give you a high-level overview of PASS. I wanted you to see this is a powerful work incentive. It doesn't get used a lot. It is complicated. That's probably why it doesn't get used a lot. If we become proficient with these work incentives, it's not to keep people on benefits. It's to advance people to self-sufficiency by utilizing every resource possible to get them there. And this is just one of those resources. So with that, I'll conclude today. I really appreciate our audience today. I know this is complicated material and that each of you is committed to really learning more about this. And I can't be more pleased about that. So everyone, great afternoon. Great to see all the names on the platform today. And we'll be catching up with you soon. If you have questions, you know where to find me. Take care, folks.